Hey, everybody, welcome back to Myth Vision. I'm your host, Derek Lambert, and I'm going to be talking with an expert neuroscientist, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. John Wathey, neuroscience, correct?
That is correct. That's where
Yeah,
that's what my PhD is in.
yeah, I almost used a different term, and I was like, let me make sure that we are good here. Um, you've been on the show in the past, Jack. For those who don't know, that's your nickname, but your name on the book's publication is John Wathey. And I hope anyone who finds this discussion interesting, which I know many, many will, that we invent God. And it's not like we do it like I'm going to invent God today. But it's a natural phenomena that is just inherent that humans develop. And I hope people will go get your books. You've got two of them out on this subject matter. You're going to give a presentation today that is going to help us to try and understand why we invented God and how that naturally came about. Anyway, before we get into your presentation, welcome back.
My pleasure. It's great to be back. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course, thank you for joining me. I'm always interested in educating people, helping people find freedom, of course, freedom from harmful ideas. And a lot of those ideas are attached to religious ideas. It's not just religion, but there's a lot invested in that. And I think what you're going to be doing is help people to understand that there's a way to look at it from a completely natural perspective to make sense of God. And I found your presentations in the past to be things I've repeated over the years when I would explain to people, one of these things that boggles my mind is how we've come to think about gods and how we're wired to do so. It's harder to not believe something than it is to believe in something, it seems. So, yeah. So, Jack, before we begin, anything we need to get, any cards on the table, any recommendations to viewers, or do we want to just dive in?
I'm happy to just dive in. At the end of the talk, I'll say something more about the book. So we'll save that for then. I'm ready to go whenever you guys are.
Okay, here we go. Let's do it. Hit the like button, ladies and gentlemen. Share this out. Comment down below. Spam the chat. Get some noise so we can help this video get some attention. People need to learn this stuff. All right, Jack, I'll be here. I'll just remain silent unless I really need clarification or something.
Okay. Well, in my first slide, you can see a truly horrific event that happened almost 25 years ago now. This was a real shock that truly changed the world. And one of the things it did was to inspire a wave of books from prominent atheists, including Richard Dawkins. He emphasized that the attacks were religiously motivated and that religious thinking is both irrational and dangerous. Now, I really loved the God Delusion and the other books like it that came out at that time. And yet I felt that they had missed something important. That something is what I call the illusion of God's presence, and that's our subject for today. My talk will be in 4 parts. In part 1, I'll try to show through example what I mean by the illusion of God's presence, a phenomenon that science has mostly overlooked. In part 2, I'll present some insights from the science of visual illusions that we'll need later in the talk. Now, you may wonder what any of this has to do with religion, but be patient. I think you'll see the relevance when we get to part 3, which is where I will try to explain the illusion of God's presence as something intrinsic to human nature. My hypothesis makes testable predictions, so we will turn to behavioral biology and neuroscience for some insights and evidence here. Of course, any good hypothesis should have explanatory power. So in part 4, I'll try to show how it explains 3 long-standing puzzles of religion, one of which was pointed out by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's the map of where we're going. Now let's move on to part 1. I said that the illusion of God's presence is something science has mostly overlooked. So to give you some context, I should first say at least a little bit about what science has studied about religion. Science has mostly explored those aspects that contribute to human social behavior. And of course, this is an extremely important dimension of religion. From it, we get things like belief in judgmental gods, greater cooperation within the in-group, greater hostility toward competing out-groups, rituals of sacrifice as proof of belief and loyalty, and group rituals that get believers moving and feeling as one. Now, in my books, I lump all of these together into what I call the social root of religion. But the illusion of God's presence comes from somewhere else. In this painting, the artist depicts it in a visual way, which is just kind of what artists do, but it's really not a visual hallucination. It's more a compelling feeling that someone else is nearby, coupled with intense emotions. And I can best convey the illusion just by reading you some first-person accounts. They seem to fall into two big categories, one of which involves a feeling that comes on gradually and persists, possibly for a lifetime. Now, this may be just a vague sense that the universe is somehow mindful and benevolent, or it could be an ongoing feeling of God's love and presence. Here's how blogger Andrew Sullivan described it. I have never doubted the existence of God, never. My acceptance of God's existence, of a force beyond everything and the source of everything, goes so far back in my consciousness and memory that I can neither recall finding this faith nor being taught it. It is the air I have always breathed. And then there's the sudden and transient kind. Often these come in times of personal crisis or helplessness. This anonymous example comes from a collection of thousands of such reports. Then, just as I was exhausted and despairing, I had the most wonderful sense of the presence of God. He was in a particular place in the room, about 5 feet from me. I didn't look up, but kept my head in my hands and my eyes shut. It was a feeling of an all-embracing love which called forth every ounce of love I had in me. It was the tenderest love I have ever encountered, and my sins were blotted out completely. So notice the strong emotions here and also the spatial specificity of the illusion in a particular place at a specific distance. There's also typically an overwhelming feeling of knowing or sense of certainty that comes with these experiences, and this is so compelling that many people take it as evidence for God's existence. One of those is Christian apologist William Lane Craig. I know Christianity is true on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. This gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. Similarly, NIH Director Francis Collins asks, why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled? Now, some of you might notice that this is really just a plain old God of the gaps argument. We don't understand these feelings. Science can never explain this. Therefore, God did it. The problem with this is that it doesn't really explain anything. It's not testable. It suggests no experiments. It's an intellectual dead end. I am not questioning the reality of the feelings. I've had those myself, but I just see them as a fascinating puzzle of human nature that cries out for a scientific explanation. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but first we need some insights from visual illusions. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality. In the Ames room illusion, the identical twins appear grossly different in size because the brain has an internal model of rectangular rooms with horizontal floors and parallel walls. Now, if you look into this room with both eyes, the illusion instantly vanishes because your depth perception reveals the true shape of the room, which is not rectangular. But as long as you look with only one eye, you see the illusion, even if you completely understand how it works. This is what psychologists call cognitive impenetrability. Our conscious understanding of the reality of the situation is not enough to penetrate the illusion. Now, this illusion comes from a different neural model. Is this a meaningful image or just some random blobs? Most of you will probably see only randomness here, but that's an illusion. There really is meaning here, but you could stare at this all day and never see it unless I do this. And for some of you, it will help if I make the image smaller, so I'll do that too. Now, by this time, some of you have seen this, and when you do, it'll just come to you instantly and vividly. Otherwise, you just don't see anything in it. And this is a very difficult one, so some of you, I'm sure, are still struggling with this. So I will give you a few hints. First of all, it's the image of a person's face in profile looking to the left. And I'm going to move my cursor over here and try to show you where the ear is. That's right here. That's the outline of the earlobe. And this is the outline of the forehead. I'm going down towards the bridge of the nose, which is here. Down here is the mouth. The lower lip is in light. The upper lip is kind of in shadow and dark. The left eye is right here, but you can't see it because it's in shadow. So I hope that has helped you to see this thing. This is called a Mooney face. It's named after psychologist Craig Mooney, who used images like these to study perception back in the 1950s. Now, it's a grossly impoverished image, stripped of all color, shades of gray, and most spatial detail. When I had it upside down, I was making reality differ from your neural model of a face, which evidently expects faces to be upright. And even now that I hope most of you can see the face, you will probably lose that percept if I turn it upside down again, or at the very least, it'll become much weaker. Now, there are two important lessons here. One is that this is yet another example of cognitive impenetrability. We have trouble seeing the face in this image if it's upside down, even when we know it's there. But if we turn it right side up, our neural model fleshes out the stripped down picture and we see the face. And that's the second lesson. Perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. When the sensory input is impoverished, the expectations of the brain's internal models become much more important. Now, of course, if the image is not impoverished, it's easy to see upside down faces. And some of you might recognize this as Margaret Thatcher. Now, if you study these images carefully, you'll see some slight differences, but overall they look similar, and at first glance they look virtually identical. But that is an illusion. Here's what they really look like. The only difference here is that the eyes and the mouth have been turned upside down in this image that's now on the left. But that's enough to make her a hideous ghoul. And because Margaret Thatcher's face was the first to be abused in this way, the illusion is named in her honor. Now, what this tells us is that there's a special purpose circuit in the brain for the holistic processing of upright faces, and our perception of the normality of a face and its emotional impact are absolutely dependent on that circuit. We are utterly blind to the ghoulishness of Margaret Thatcher's altered face if it's upside down. What the illusion cannot tell us, though, is whether this special purpose circuit is innately specified or is the product of experience. After all, we almost never see upside down faces. Maybe the brain is lousy at perceiving them because it just hasn't seen enough of them. So is holistic face perception innate or learned? Well, there is a way to find out. Twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception. Identical twins share 100% of their genes, but fraternal twins only about 50% on average. If identical twins are significantly more alike in their face perception abilities than fraternal twins, then that's compelling evidence of a genetic contribution. Now, to do this, we need tests of face perception that give us numbers, and luckily there are some. I don't have time to explain these, but all you need to know is that they are sensitive tests of holistic face perception that give numerical scores. The twin study found a strong genetic contribution. About a third of the variance across individuals comes from genetic factors. We even know where this circuit is in the brain because damage to the fusiform gyrus, shown here in red, causes profound face blindness or prosopagnosia. And it's not the whole area in red here that matters for face processing. If these two little red spots called the fusiform face area are damaged, then you get face blindness. And in many cases, damaging only the one in the right hemisphere is sufficient. Now, it's a little misleading to call it face blindness because people who have it can still tell you they are seeing a face if you show them a photograph of a face. But what they cannot do is tell you whose face it is, even if it's a famous person or a close family member. Also, the deficit is permanent. No other part of the brain can learn to take over the role of a damaged fusiform face area. The astonishing thing, though, is that face blindness is permanent even if the damage happens in a one-day-old infant. Now, this paper I'm citing here describes a teenage boy who suffered a stroke that destroyed his fusiform face area when he was only 1 day old. He had profound and permanent face blindness, but his recognition of non-face objects was much less impaired. What's astonishing about this case is that infancy is the time when the brain is most plastic, when the function lost to local damage can often be taken over by some other area of cortex, but not if the damage is in the fusiform face area. What this means is that the fusiform face area is an extremely brittle, single-purpose, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute, despite the fact that this thing is a learning machine. The whole purpose of the fusiform face area is to learn to recognize thousands of individual faces over the course of a human lifetime. So it's not like there's no synaptic plasticity going on in this thing. It's extremely plastic. All it does is learning. That's what it's for. But it's a specialized kind of learning. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. Highly specialized learning of this kind requires a foundation of innate knowledge. And this raises an interesting question. Can a newborn infant use any of this innate knowledge about faces? Well, it turns out they can and do. Newborn infants have some holistic face perception. They spend more time looking at an upright Mooney face than one that's upside down. Also, they prefer a Mooney face to a similar non-face image. And we know from a clever habituation test that they see these two images as the same, but they see these two as different. Okay, now we're ready to tackle this. The illusion of God's presence and my explanation of it. What exactly is this? How does this compare to a visual illusion? Why does it happen? What is the brain trying to model here? When I try to explain this in terms of biology and evolution, I sometimes get the objection that religion comes entirely from indoctrination, so my hypothesis must be wrong. So let's get that out of the way first. There are two lines of evidence that religion is partly a biological thing. One is the observation from anthropology that religion is a cultural universal. And the other comes from twin studies, our gold standard, which finds that religiousness is significantly heritable. Roughly half the variance in religiousness across individuals comes from genetic factors. But why would natural selection favor this? Well, my short answer is that it doesn't. It favors something else that makes us vulnerable to this illusion. I think there's a completely natural explanation for the illusion of God's presence, one that has to do with the peculiar constraints of human infancy. I think the neonatal brain expects something godlike, but that something isn't God. And we can see a hint of what it really is expecting in the Moreau reflex. This is an infantile startle reflex that's thought to be a vestige from our primate ancestors. As infants, they would cling to their mother's fur, and whenever they were jostled or startled, they had to reflexively reach out and grab on tight. I think you'll agree it bears a striking resemblance to Pentecostal prayer. This is just one of many examples of what I call the infantile or neonatal root of religion, which I believe explains the illusion of God's presence. In contrast to the social root, The neonatal root of religion is characterized by belief in a God of unconditional love, maternal compassion and caring, infantilism in religious feeling and ritual, intense spiritual longing, and the illusion of God's presence. This kind of religiousness appears to be a byproduct of selective pressures for the survival of helpless infants. And I have formalized this idea as a hypothesis that has 3 parts. Part 1 of the hypothesis is that a newborn infant has an innate neural model of its mother. Now, it's not a detailed image of any specific person, but only a sense of the existence of some vague and amorphous primordial savior out there somewhere. And here are the essential elements of this model as I conceive it. A newborn infant knows that its mother exists, that she knows how to help the infant, that she's able to help, wants to help, and will help when she hears crying. Now, there's a bit more to it than that. There's also some physiologically critical information about mother providing nourishment through nipples that can be recognized by scent and touch and taste. And there's also the idea of her having a melodic voice, a feminine pitch, and about her having a face and some rough idea of what a face is and what a face looks like. And on the left here, you can see what a mother's face actually does look like to a newborn with its still developing visual system. This is an impoverished image, sort of like a Mooney face. So you can see how it would be helpful for infants to have some innate capacity for holistic face processing. I am suggesting that they have more than that, especially in the cortex that will ultimately support social behavior in adulthood. But in infancy, it supports attachment to mom, the primordial savior. So that's part 1 of the hypothesis. Part 2 is that the circuitry that implements this innate model of the mother persists into adulthood, but normally lies dormant. And part 3 is that the existence of this circuitry in the adult can give rise to the illusory feeling of a loving presence, especially, though not necessarily, under conditions that mimic the helplessness of infancy. These feelings are often interpreted in religious terms because a crude mother-shaped vacuum is easily misperceived as a God-shaped vacuum. Now, this hypothesis is consistent with what we know about the newborns and hatchlings of many vertebrate species. Having some kind of innate knowledge is the rule, not the exception. A good example are the herring gull chicks studied by Nico Tinbergen. They have an innate visual model of the parent's head and bill, especially that prominent red spot near the tip. They peck at that spot to solicit feeding, and newly hatched chicks will do this without any prior experience. Tinbergen discovered that the chicks would also peck at artificial models of the bill. And if he exaggerated thinness, redness, and contrast near the tip, he could make a stimulus that was even more effective than the natural one. This is a classic example of what ethologists call a supernormal stimulus. In the same way, I suggest that God is a supernormal stimulus for the innate neural model of mother. God is a kind of superparent who answers prayer, is perfectly loving, omnipotent, and omniscient. These exaggerated attributes excite that crude model of a mother even better than a real mother does. And when it's excited, the innate certainty of the mother's existence feeds the certainty of God's existence and the illusion of his or her sensed presence. Another useful metaphor here is the illusory phantom limb of the amputee. The phantom limb happens because the brain of an amputee expects the missing limb to be there, and that expectation creates the illusion. The patient's conscious knowledge that it's an illusion doesn't make it go away. I like to combine both metaphors into one catchy phrase. In the light of biology, the God of unconditional love is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. God is a supernormal stimulus in the ethological sense to the innate model of mother, and God's presence is a phantom sensation in the neurological sense, because the innate model expects a primordial savior to be there, just as the brain of the amputee expects the missing limb to be there. And this similarity of the phantom limb and the sensed presence is more than just a metaphor. Both the phantom limb and the sensed presence are illusions of embodiment, one's own in the case of a phantom limb, or someone else's in the case of a sensed presence. There's an interesting part of the brain called the temporoparietal junction that's involved in both of these illusions. I think this is likely to be one of several places in the brain where the innate model of mother is implemented, but it's not the whole thing. If you stimulate this area with electric current, the subject may experience the illusion of a sensed presence, though seldom with a religious interpretation. The spatial and the personal aspects of it are there, but the divine love usually is not. Those feelings of divine love may, however, come from this place. This is the orbitofrontal cortex, which I think is also likely to be an essential part of the innate model of mother. It's on the underside of the frontal lobes, just above the eyes. Now, of course, it's what the orbitofrontal cortex does that makes it interesting. From monkeys, we know that it's important for reinforcement learning. Neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex learn to become excited by a previously neutral stimulus, like a green triangle flashed onto a computer screen, but only if it is paired with a tasty treat. The tasty treat is called a primary reinforcer because it is innately rewarding, and the triangle becomes a secondary reinforcer only with learning. And by the way, the encoding of primary reinforcers in this part of the brain appears to be yet another example where innate knowledge is an essential foundation for learning. Now, we also know from neural imaging experiments that the orbitofrontal cortex is specifically activated in human parents when they see infants, and in infants when they hear their mother's voice. Now, it's this finding, of course, and others like it, that are most relevant to my hypothesis of the innate model of the mother. But all of these things taken together strongly suggest that the innate model of the mother, or at least the part of it that's in orbitofrontal cortex, can be thought of as the set of primary reinforcers needed for learning human social behavior. This could explain why the innate model persists into adulthood. It persists because it's an innate foundation for learning. Primary reinforcers like gentle touch, a smiling face, an affectionate tone of voice, all of these are innately rewarding and drive us to connect with others, not only in infancy, but throughout life. The most compelling evidence of this is that damage to the orbitofrontal cortex in humans causes acquired sociopathy. Now, in this syndrome, cognitive abilities are normal. Memory, language, math skills, logical reasoning, all of that stuff is fine. The problem is that these patients can't feel the emotional consequences of reward and punishment. They lack gut feelings. They also can't anticipate how their actions affect others, so they are devoid of empathy. Because of these deficits, they make terrible decisions, though not usually rising to the level of criminality. But to quote one particularly famous example from the neurological literature, they might lose their jobs, make stupid investments, go bankrupt, get divorced, marry a sex worker. In short, their lives just fall apart. Interestingly, though, acquired sociopathy is most severe when the damage occurs in infancy. As children, these patients are disruptive and impulsive in school. They're always getting in trouble for pathological lying, aggression, and stealing. They have poor hygiene and bizarre diets. They practice careless sex starting in their early teen years, and they make dangerously negligent parents. What this tells us is that the orbitofrontal cortex is an extremely brittle, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute. Well, that should sound familiar. We have seen this movie before. This is exactly what we saw in the fusiform face area. And like the fusiform face area, this innately specified thing is a learning machine. Well, this is all very fascinating and says a lot about my hypothetical innate model of the mother. But does the orbital frontal cortex have anything to do with feeling God's presence? It should if my hypothesis is right. Unfortunately, of course, this is a kind of a tough experiment to do. Ideally, you'd like to scan the brains of people in that critical moment when they're having the sudden and intense kind of feeling of God's presence. But for most people, that's kind of hard to summon on demand. And yet, if there's anyone who could do it or come close to doing it, it would surely be these people, the Carmelite nuns of Montreal. They spend much of their time seeking closeness to God. Luckily, Montreal also has some neuroscientists, and 2 of them persuaded 15 Carmelite nuns to be subjects in a brain scanning experiment. Their neural activity in a mystical state was compared to that in a baseline state, resting with their eyes closed. In the mystical condition, the subjects were asked to remember and relive with their eyes closed the most intense mystical experience ever felt in their lives as members of the Carmelite order. And here's a quote from the paper. During the qualitative interviews conducted at the end of the experiment, several subjects mentioned that during the mystical condition, they felt the presence of God, his unconditional and infinite love, as well as plenitude and peace. So that sounds pretty close to what we're looking for. What was going on in the brain during all of this? The paper listed 14 brain areas specifically active in the mystical state relative to baseline, and here I'm showing you the top 5. And at the very top of the list, the most active is the orbital frontal cortex, so that's encouraging. Now, I don't have a specific interpretation for the one below it, the middle temporal area, but for these next 3, the inferior and superior parietal lobules, these are all either in or near the temporoparietal junction. That's the area that handles embodiment and where direct stimulation can sometimes elicit the illusory sensed presence. Now, I want to stress that all of this is merely suggestive. It does not prove my hypothesis, but it is at least consistent with it. Okay, now I realize I've covered a lot of ground in this part of the talk, so I'd like to quickly go over the main points. Religion is partly a biological thing. There's a neonatal root of religion that science has largely overlooked. God's presence is an illusion in high-order association cortex that retains an innate model of mother. In light of ethology and neuroscience, God is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. And finally, the hypothesis of the innate model of mother leads to testable predictions, and we saw evidence for one of them in the orbitofrontal cortex. Now, a good hypothesis may also explain some long-standing puzzles, and we have time to look at 3. Puzzle number 1, why is God two-faced? Why do believers tell you their God will damn you to hell, yet in the same breath insist that he loves you unconditionally? Well, you already know my answer. They are blind to this blatant contradiction because of powerful intuitions from the social and neonatal roots of religion, which tell them that both descriptions of God must be true. Now, if I'm right about this, if these really are the dominant sources of religious emotion, then this insight applies to more than just the two-faced God. It means that religion is in some sense two-dimensional. If we mix the social and neonatal ingredients in the right proportions, we should be able to cook up just about any kind of religiousness there is. Or more precisely, if we could measure how much a person's belief comes from the social and neonatal components, we could plot anyone in this space. In my books, I include a rough draft of a psychometric test that tries to do exactly that. The latest version has 44 items that assess the 10 qualities in these 2 lists. And you should try to think of this as a prediction, because if the test were given to many subjects of diverse religious background, with all of the items from both dimensions of religion just kind of mixed together, then the social and neonatal items should naturally segregate into these two distinct factors in a factor analysis. Now, and that's just kind of a statistical technique that's done with psychometric testing. So that experiment has not been done, but it should be. Puzzle number 2. Why are women more religious than men? This is probably the single most robust finding in the psychology of religion. Across nearly all religions, and by most measures of religiousness, women are significantly more religious than men on average. Now, I think there are probably several different factors behind this, but the idea of the innate model of mother suggests a new one. I call it the crosstalk hypothesis for the greater religiousness of women, and it comes from something I showed you earlier in orbitofrontal cortex. Both adult caring for infants and infantile longing for mother come from the same neural circuitry. This means that these two things should be in some sense correlated. There's crosstalk between them. Individuals with greater empathetic caring as adults should, as infants, have greater infantile longing for mom, and as adults, greater spiritual longing for God. But there's one more critical piece to this puzzle, and that's the observation that women are more caring and nurturing than men. This means that they should have greater spiritual longing than men, which makes them more susceptible to the illusion of God's presence, and therefore more religious than men in the neonatal dimension. And that last part is important because it makes specific predictions. For example, veneration of God as an infant should have relatively greater appeal for women than for men. On average, women will score higher on the neonatal dimension relative to the social than men. And greater nurturance or empathetic caring as a personality trait should correlate with greater religiousness of the neonatal kind, independent of gender. And I think we can see an interesting example of this in Francis Collins. He became a Christian early in his career as a physician caring for cancer patients. I think it was his great compassion, not the infamous frozen waterfall, that brought him to Jesus. And that brings us to puzzle number 3. Why do elite scientists like Francis Collins believe in God? Years ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed to this puzzle and said, there's something else going on that nobody seems to be talking about. Something mysterious and alluring about religion that can seduce even the most brilliant of scientific minds. He cited these data from a paper in Nature. As of the late 1990s, about 90% of the American public believed in a personal God who answers prayer. For American scientists, however, that number is only about 40%. But when you look at elite scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, 93% of them reject belief in a personal God. That was the message of the paper. But Neil's point was that the authors had missed the most exciting and puzzling thing in their data. Namely, why isn't this number 0? Religiosity drops off with increasing scientific training, but it reaches a non-zero asymptote. Why do 7% of the most brilliant scientific minds in the country believe in a personal God? That was Neil's challenge. But he also went on to argue that if we really want to understand religion, these are the people we should be studying, not the general public. Whatever it is that can make believers out of these folks must be the most concentrated essence of the thing we're trying to understand. Well, my answer, of course, is that this comes from the neonatal root of religion, and what's seducing them is the cognitively impenetrable illusion of God's presence. And again, this makes testable predictions. Relative to the 93% of their colleagues who do not believe in God, this puzzling 7% should be significantly enriched in women, physicians, and others who score high on tests of empathy and nurturance. And relative to those in the general public who do believe in God, the 7% will be significantly enriched in people who identify as spiritual but not religious, which is really just another way of saying their faith comes mostly from the neonatal root. I'd like to close with one last description of the illusion of God's presence, this one experienced on the moon by astronaut Gene Cernan. We're now in a good position to make sense of it. I was literally standing on a plateau somewhere out there in space, a plateau that science and technology had allowed me to get to. But what I was feeling at that moment in time, science had no answers for. Because there I was, and there you are, the Earth, dynamic, overwhelming. And I felt that the world had just too much purpose, too much logic. It was just too beautiful to have happened by accident. There has to be somebody bigger than you and bigger than me. And I mean this in a spiritual sense, not a religious sense. There has to be a creator of the universe who stands above the religions that we ourselves create to govern our lives. First, notice how he rejects the God of the social root, not a religious sense, above religions that govern our lives. Also, we can see here the God of the gaps. Science has no answer. And the argument from design, too beautiful to have happened by accident. But I consider both of these mere conscious rationalizations of the powerful intuition that was really behind this experience. And here is that intuition, the certainty that there is somebody bigger. This, I suggest, comes from the innate model of the mother. Science does have an answer for this. It hasn't yet been completely tested, but it explains a lot, and it is specific enough that it can be tested. You can learn more about this at my website, watheyresearch.com. And of course, even more in my books, The Illusion of God's Presence and The Phantom God. And I should take a minute here to explain that these are not parts 1 and 2 of a long story. Instead, they tell the same scientific story, but with different emphasis. The Illusion of God's Presence covers ideas and evidence mainly from behavioral biology, psychology, child development, and neuroscience in roughly equal proportion, which is sort of what I tried to do in this talk today. The Phantom God covers the same subjects, but with much, much more emphasis on neuroscience. The other subjects are only briefly summarized in the first 2 chapters. The rest of the book takes a deep plunge into the brain. It's shorter than The Illusion of God's Presence, but more technically demanding. So I recommend starting with The Illusion of God's Presence. And that is the end of the slides. I'm going to give me just a second here to turn off the slide sharing. And that should bring us back to Derek.
Hey, good to see you. Great presentation as usual. We've done this years ago for those who've never watched. And I've always been fascinated by this because intuitively I feel what you're saying. I can recall experiences of my own. And I had a really loving mom, a very, very protecting, loving mom. And in fact, I held on to religion. The best way I kind of describe my own personal experience here, Jack, is I had an altar call. I already knew about Jesus, probably believed in him in some way, but never had like a profound moment of memory where I recall the euphoric, I want to call it social placebo, that was a different next level experience. My mom and dad loved me a lot. Dad was alcoholic.
Oh.
And he was my hero, though. He was the invincible Heracles. He was God. He was God Almighty in my mind as a child. No one could beat him, that kind of thing. You know, my dad could beat your dad up kind of kid at school. And my dad was actually a retired Green Beret in the Special Forces. So he probably really could beat your dad up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so he was elite. He was hardcore and alcoholic, which made it even more intense when he would turn into a werewolf. And I remember the altar call message being, there's a God, a Father God that loves you unconditionally. He'll never let you down. And so I went down to that message and I felt like I found it. And he sent his son in the whole 9 of the Christian message.
Yeah.
And I recall for, I'd say, at least the next 15 years of my life, maybe up to 20, before I end up coming to a place where I start questioning and going through enough struggles of my own through addiction. It was opiate addiction. And some of the brain experts I've talked to in the past talk about psychologically or even socially why opiates are people who are attached to opiates versus uppers. So downers versus uppers is like a real thing. And I like downers, right? I like to relax. I don't like to get super duper hype. And he was explaining how that plays a role. I can't remember the exact science behind it, but I was having an interview and explaining and just laying my life out on the table. Right now we're doing together, we're doing what do you call that? Where you cut the frog open and you're digging in the insides and
dissection.
Stuff. Yeah. We're dissecting Derek Lambert. Okay. So I go to, my life's in shambles. I'm not able to stay clean and sober. And my ideas of God are like, I'm going to die, or I need to like really reconsider what I think, what I believe about God, but God's still there. It's just God became like that moon landing guy who's saying it's not, maybe it's bigger than all the world religions. I couldn't let go of the sense of presence. There was a sense of presence that I still had. And then it was science over time that made me to start rationalizing like the science behind why the presence is there, how the brain functions, that we evolved, all of those things that I did not believe beforehand, started to be convinced by listening to cases from evolutionary biologists, started looking at the fossil records, started considering, holy crap, we are primates. And then once you start having to put together the pieces based on observable, testable facts that are on the ground, that's when it started to like really dawn on me. Oh my gosh, then why am I hearing many atheists online saying, no, you're all born atheist and no one's born, believing in gods, right? I get not a particular label of a God, but like, it's almost like they don't recognize that the hardware is all already there. Even the software, mom is part of the software. Dad is part. I mean, like, you see what I'm saying? Like, it's already there.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, I rambled. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what I just said, if you don't mind.
No, I understand completely what you're saying. I'm very sympathetic to that view and to that sort of course of evolution of your thinking. The way your way of thinking about religion changed over the years. Something sort of like that happened with me too. I was fortunate enough never to have to go through addiction myself, but everybody goes through. For me, I had some struggles with depression when I was a teenager, and I guess that's what got me started at first, thinking, couple that tendency as a depressed teenager to the observation that the world isn't the way it should be if there is a loving God. There's an awful lot of suffering and cruelty and truly meaningless suffering in the world. And so even as a teenager, I could see something is wrong with this picture. I can't quite figure out what. Maybe there is a God, but it's not the God that my parents taught me about in Sunday school long, long ago. That doesn't work. So I gradually went through a process of evolution in my own thinking and believing, just like you did. So I'm very sympathetic to that. And even long after dispensing completely with any belief in God, long after I started calling myself an atheist, I have still had those experiences of the presence, this loving presence that seems to be so real and palpable that I could just reach out and touch it. I identify a lot with that woman who said, I didn't open my eyes, but I just knew he was 5 feet away from me. I have had that feeling.
Mm-hmm. That's what I think what blows me away as a layperson who does not know the neuroscience that you do, the psychology that you've studied in all these years and everything. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine how much more convinced you are of your own hypothesis and how much it really makes sense. At least if someone is watching this and they go, I don't buy every single thing he said, there's a huge chunk of it that I feel like intuitively makes perfect sense. I almost thought of Plato's cave earlier when you were describing this, and it's kind of like we're realizing the shadows on the wall. That doesn't mean when we went out to look at the sunlight, like we have all reality figured out or something. No, we're saying we're closer to not being as delusional as maybe we once were, which I think the delusion was part of a survival. It's all part of survival. I mean, it works,
Sure.
it functions, it helps us stay alive, to be very attached to our mothers and fathers, the social aspect, every aspect, really. I think it all makes perfect sense for our survival that we are this way. But I'm thinking to myself, here you are wired in the mom. You can hear, you're just now, consciousness is starting to develop, so to speak, through all of the biology inside of her. And of course, face recognition, all of these things, these systems that our brains develop inside the mom. And I don't remember as a child whining for food, but it intuitively happened, and mom would nourish me. And that expectation for an agent to take care of me or to be there for me, have its presence be there for me, even if I know how to lift a spoon to my own mouth, that wiring never left. And in fact, because that was, as you said, the most plasticity of our lives as infants, the rest of my life is always going to be wired to have some sense of that infancy experience that we went through for years with our mother or our fathers,
Sure.
and being connected to an agent that we expect to be there, even if they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And another way that I sometimes experience it is when I'm out in nature. I'm a nature lover. I love to go out hiking in the mountains, and when I'm out there, often this happens when I'm alone out there. I just get this feeling, it's sort of a warm, fuzzy feeling that I am home. I am where I belong. I'm surrounded by this beautiful universe, the trees, the animals, everything is just, it just conjures up. It's almost like, I'm being cuddled in my mother's arms, right? It's the same kind of feeling.
Mm.
Um, and that just wells up in me, that, like you say, it's deeply embedded in our brains. We can't help it. Sometimes it just comes out.
Back to a personal experience story. I was getting clean off heroin the very last time I ever was using heroin. I was injecting it. I went from, just swallowing a 5 milligram Percocet many, 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 many years back. And it made me feel euphoric, like I was on a warm cloud, is the best way I could describe it. I just had a headache. My mother-in-law was addicted at the time, and she's like, I don't have any Tylenol, but I got this Percocet 5. You can just take it. It'll get rid of your headache. Whoa. Now, I'm not blaming her because, I know she was already deep in it, but I already had a sense of an addictive behavior, and I'm sure I would have ended up down this path regardless if she, gave me something that time or not. But there was like wow, this has made me feel great. My mother, who's not an addict, experienced this once, and she said she felt so good. She went to take a second one. Next thing you know, she's vomiting on the floor, and she called me. She didn't tell me this till later. She felt guilty. I had to come pick her up off the floor, lay her in bed, because she couldn't get off the floor and vomit because of the opiates. Anyway,
Wow.
she said, and she's not anything of an addict, literally, right? So I'm getting off heroin, and I'm looking for signs. I believe the universe is trying to look out for me. I need to believe in something in my mind. I feel like if I'm about to die, like I'm looking for something to give me signs throughout the world. And I go to the gas station. This is several days after I'm clean. There's a newspaper, and there's a image of an arm with holding the veins are pumped out from like a tourniquet type situation, trying to get the blood going, and a needle. And I'm like, yo, that is my life. So I open it, and the local rehab place, someone described when they were being interviewed by the local newspaper what it was like. And when they said what it was like, I think almost every addict of opiates, heroin, Opana, oxycodone, oxymorphine, codeine, hydrocodone, I'm just listing off these things for anyone who's ever experienced opiate addiction in whatever form it was. They described it as God came down from heaven and wrapped his arms around me. Now, notice the cultural context. This is the social, not the mother side, but wrapped his arms around me and said, "Everything is going to be okay. When you inject, when you sniff, when you swallow, whatever, when you get that, there's a sense of comfort like your mother." And it reminds me of one time I was having surgery as a really little kid to get rid of warts on my thumb. They put me to sleep. They actually wrapped me in warm towels. I don't know why the hospital did this at the time, but they, I guess, distracted me, injected me, didn't notice as a kid. I do remember the memory. They wrapped me in warm blanket and they put me to sleep. But I felt comforted. I felt warm. And that's what I felt from the opiates. And that's what I remember it feeling like when my mother would, take care of me and things like that as a child. So
Yeah.
there's so much related to this that I think you're tapping into. And sorry to give you the long story, but I think
No, it's very relevant, especially to my second book, The Phantom God, where I, like I said, take a deep dive into the brain. I mentioned this only briefly in passing in the first book, but in the second book, there's a whole chapter about the part of the brain that's involved in the reward pathways.
mm,
And there's the sort of the epicenter of the reward pathway is a part of the brain deep below the cortex. It's subcortical, called the nucleus accumbens. It's a small thing, relatively small thing, but it sends its axons all over the cortex. It innervates a wide area of the brain with dopamine releasing fibers. And this part of the brain is critical for the kinds of things I talked about happening in orbitofrontal cortex, where you're doing reinforcement learning. You have these primary reinforcers built in, like this sort of innate model of things that taste good. Your taste and smell and flavors and stuff like that develops in there too. Your preferences for foods develop in there. Food, by the way, can become an addiction in a sense. People can lose control in an addictive sort of way with food. But anyway, addictive drugs, act in some way directly on those neurons in the nucleus accumbens. They short circuit the sensations that give you healthy rewards, like the warm and fuzzy feeling that an infant has when the mother is holding it, or the scent and taste of the mother's milk and all of that stuff. That's supposed to be rewarding, and it is. And the part of the brain that's doing it is this nucleus accumbens. And it's in a way, it's almost making the infant addicted to its mother, but in a positive sense of the word.
right.
Attached is really the right word to use. Attached is the better word. When you're taking an addictive drug, though, you're sort of short-circuiting all of that. You're bypassing all of the healthy stuff that would normally, healthy behavioral and sensations, all of that good stuff that would normally be getting you connected or attached or devoted to something that's good for you, like foods that taste good, or a person who loves you and whose love you need to survive. Instead of that, it just goes straight to the reward. It just cuts straight to the reward. And what you're being rewarded for now is injecting your arm with a needle, or taking a Percocet, or whatever it is, and sort of all of the milieu around that, all of the paraphernalia involved in that. All of that now becomes the stuff that you're attached to and ultimately addicted to, and it can be very, very destructive. It's not mere coincidence that you're bringing up addiction in the context of this feeling of God's presence. The same part of the brain is doing that in both cases.
There's so much there. I got a super chat I want to get to in just a moment. Chris, forgive me, but while I have it on my mind, so I don't forget, I would go through a pattern. So the first thing that came to my mind was what you just described about the reward system and becoming addicted or attached to your mother. And I've raised, me and my wife raised 3 kids, and each child would go from, my wife had a difficult time breastfeeding, but each child would still have a difficulty. I imagine many kids who probably are used to breast moving to the nipple of the bottle, moving from that to cutting that off. They're going through withdrawal, mental withdrawal. Like, you can watch children go through withdrawal just getting off of the bottle to normal solid foods. Like, that transition is earth shattering and existential crisis for these
Yeah.
kids. And I say that to say, a lot of us who deconvert have this kind of existential crisis where we're starting to realize, oh my gosh. And I think the way that I've coped with it, and it just was a gradual thing. I couldn't crash and burn. I actually found out I was an atheist after I had a period of time of already thinking this way. I then went, oh my gosh, I need to tell everybody where I'm at. Like, I didn't even realize I got there. And maybe that was a comfortable way of me realizing it was me all along. I looked at the sciences. I started studying the psychology. I started looking into the evolution of humans and started going, this makes a lot of sense. And it was not harmful or scary. But in the process, psychologically, I had a bedrock. Like, it was me. I still have meaning. I still saw myself as you all along were the one who carried yourself through those suffering trials in the past. It wasn't a God in the heavens. It was your mom. It was your dad. It was you. It was your wife. It was your kids. It was the real tangible people in your life that helped you to make it through those things. And in a sense, I was able to reinterpret those past experiences, realizing at the time I really did believe those were the deity in the sky, or it was this, but all along it was really me. And I'll say one more thing and get your thoughts, and then we'll get to the super chat. Is this, just because I didn't want to forget this, I'm reminded of the amazing science fiction movie Interstellar. Love the movie. Did you watch it?
I have seen it, yes.
Okay. All along, spoiler, if you haven't seen it, I'm already giving you the end. So you may not want to hear this if you haven't watched it, but if you have, this might hit different. You'll know what I'm talking about. Matthew McConaughey the whole time. Now, it's science fiction, but he was there with his daughter. He was his daughter's ghost. And when he makes it into the fourth dimension through the black hole and all, and he's finally reaching back out to Murphy, it was him all along, right?
Right.
And for me, I have a sense of respect for ancestry worship because I understand it. But when we have this daddy in the sky that we don't really have that attachment to, we've made a leap that I think it would make sense to cultically, ritualistically honor our parents, our family, or whatever. That makes a lot better sense to me than this thing. It's much more intuitive, it makes a lot of sense. But you then have to go, well, naturally imagine our ancestors looking at the thunderclap or imagining, how did the volcano happen? I don't think my dad did that. So there's this room to let another agent fill the gap, or agents, plural, because it was polytheistic. And you could see how my mind works.
Yes.
Your hypothesis. But
yes, exactly. And when this happens, when the ancient cultures who have been practicing ancestor veneration see the volcano erupting and the earthquake happens, or the drought happens, and all sorts of terrible natural disasters, and they're imbuing superpowers onto the ancestors or whatever, and they're turning their venerated ancestors into super ghosts who have superpowers. Those superpowers, like I said in the talk, excite the innate neural model of the mother even better than the real mother does. They are supernormal stimuli, like the long, skinny, bright red supernormal stimulus for the herring gull's beak. It's that kind of thing.
Right. That was my experience. Again, I'm going to shut up after this. We'll hit the super chat and then we'll continue. If there aren't any super chats after this, is I would go between addiction to opiates, alcohol. I'd switch. I'd quit that and try to do alcohol because, after a while, not only money, there were financial problems with it because trying to get it off the streets, it's expensive, whatever. I'd withdraw. It sucked. Eventually, I would try to stop. I'd go to a 12-step meeting, get back into church, be very, very devoted to Jesus. I mean, like completely delusionally devoted. I was so obsessed and OCD, and it was like my latching was, I mean, it was just over the top. And then I'd get back into the gym, exercise. I'd go through a phase where I'd get really strong, and I'd sometimes I'd dabble with testosterone as well to try and like really increase my muscle. I don't know. It just gave me a sense of, I don't know how to describe it. It made me feel good too, and not in the same high sense, but like it did allow you to feel better overall. And then I'd end up relapsing, and I'd end up back on painkillers when I'd get off the hormones because something would go on with me through that experience where I'd end up wanting to feel like fill in a hole. I'd get back on the painkillers, and I'd go through this vicious loop that would repeat for the next 15 years of my life until I finally got off the heroin. And I really credit not only did I find community that helped me initially get off, but I would have just possibly returned. What it was finding myself. So I found researching, learning, deconstructing the harmful idea and worldview that I had, I think has given me more completeness and wholeness today than ever I had in the Christian religion. And when I ask many Christians today about certain doctrines, they act like that's not in the text, but I knew that was in the text and believed it in my mind in light of the fact of like hating the flesh. All you got to do is read about Middle Platonism, read Paul's letters, how much he hates the body, to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord, to love this life is to lose it, to hate this life is to gain it, and all the theology that's involved with hating this, and even your greatest deeds. Your righteousness is like filthy rags. Everything you do that is good is not you. It's Christ in you. You can't even take credit for anything right. Like I saw that stuff and tried to make my brain like match it, and I'd still struggle with pornography or addiction and the cognitive dissonance and the struggle for the years of going, am I yours, God? How come I can't beat this with your help? I'm begging you. I'm crying like a child asking his father to help me. Why can't you just help me? Like, I believe you're there. And nothing would change, Jack. And I would try everything I could to stop. And people just don't get it. People who are in it that are comfortable and they don't have maybe the same experience, maybe the same extreme nature that I do about obsessing over it. I don't know, but I know that this path I'm on now, I haven't had the thought. It's been 11 years, no heroin, 12 years, no alcohol, nothing. And I don't even have the craving. I have no interest. I only empathize with people who struggle. So,
yeah. Well, several things you said there really resonate with me. One is that, in the talk, I talk about all of these intuitions that we have, that's some of which are innate and very powerful, and you can't really get rid of them. And like I said earlier, even now, having been an atheist for many years, I still can have those illusions of God's presence or of a loving presence just coming out of nowhere. But I should add to that, and what you just said triggered this thought. I should add to that even though those intuitions are still there, we still do have a cortex. We still do have, a lot of other stuff going on in our brains. We have the ability to learn to reason. We can become more skeptical and scientific in our thinking, even if it's true, and I think it is true, that scientific thinking does not come easily or naturally. You can train yourself to become more skeptical and scientific in your thinking. And there's a great book on this subject. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the author's name escapes me at the moment. But it's a psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, that's his name, Daniel Kahneman. And I think there might be
there's a Patrick Egan as well, or Egan.
Yeah, there's a co-author. Anyway, that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that's it. He comes at it from the point of view of psychology, not neuroscience, but it's the same idea. He talks about intuitions that people have, sometimes acquired through learning. Not necessarily all of them are innate, but some of both. And that's fast thinking. Intuition makes it possible for you to make decisions quickly and react quickly. And they can be very useful in that way. They can have survival advantages in that way. And that's partly why we have them. That's why our brain was shaped in that way. But we can also learn to do the harder, slower thinking. That's what Kahneman calls type 2. Type 1 is the fast thinking, intuitive, and type 2 is the slower, deeper thinking that involves things like logical reasoning, sometimes mathematics. It takes time, it takes effort. You can't come to the answer instantly. You have to work at it and maybe even do some math on a calculator or whatever. But humans are capable of doing that, and you shouldn't take my talk as in the sense that, oh, this is all hopeless. We all can't change. We're all stuck with this no matter what. Yeah, we're stuck with it no matter what, but we can change, and we can learn to think more rationally and more skeptically and scientifically, and be open to new ideas, including scientific ideas, open to evolution as an explanation for where life really comes from and how it really works. And when you do that, when you have that scientific outlook on life, I agree with you, life becomes better in just about every respect. What you said also triggered another association, and that has to do with a fascinating article I read while researching the first book. It was I think there was a series of articles, actually. They were published in Christianity Today back in the 70s or 80s, somewhere around there. What triggered the series of articles was a letter to the editor written by a pastor. The Christianity Today is a magazine that's written for Protestant pastors mostly in this country. And one of them wrote in a letter confessing about his obsession with sex. He was being tormented by lust. He used the word lust, the sin of lust. He was struggling with the sin of lust. And he gave this long, kind of sad and sordid tale of his struggles with things like pornography and going to X-rated movies and the seedy part of town and watching strippers at strip joints and all this kind of stuff, and then feeling horribly guilty about it. He was never unfaithful to his wife. He was married, had a sex life. He was a good husband to his wife in the sense that he never cheated on her. But because of all of these dabblings in pornography and so on, he felt that he had, and he was just racked with guilt. That letter to the editor triggered a response that the magazine editor said they have never had before or since. That pastor after pastor after pastor sent in letters saying similar things, or either that or just denouncing him as, Satan's spawn, and he shouldn't even be allowed to have his letter in the magazine. But this is a real problem that people struggle with because of the strange attitude towards sex that comes with religion. Religion has very weird, obsessive, conflicting, you use the phrase cognitive dissonance, very, very conflicting feelings, powerful and conflicting feelings about sex. They feel it is shameful and evil. They used to describe, a small example, they used to describe Shakers, this cult that existed in the United States back in the 19th century mostly. They used to describe Shakers as people who lived perfect lives and never sinned. Well, what they meant when they said that was that they never had sex. When you're a Shaker, you go into this cult where men and women are separated, don't live in the even if they're married, they're physically separated into a men's dormitory and a woman's dormitory. They never touch each other. They never mix. They become celibate. Okay,
Right.
that's a big part of Shakerism, and it was described by other people who saw it from the outside in what they to them was a favorable term, as these are people who never sin. Wow, that's fantastic. Well, the rest of Christianity is sort of like that, just watered down a little bit. But, relatively harmless things like pornography are, just god awful sins. That's the sin of lust. My God, how terrible. How can I live with myself?
Right.
And, when you free yourself of these I don't have time to go into where that comes from, by the way, the strangeness of the obsession with sex in religion. I have a whole chapter on that or part of a chapter, a large part of a chapter on that, chapter 8 in the first book. It's kind of a long argument. I won't go into it here, but
Okay.
you can free yourself from all of that.
Yes.
You can learn if you understand what sex is from the point of view of a biologist or a psychologist, that lust is perfectly normal. It's healthy. It's good for you. Don't feel bad about it. Just go out and find yourself a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever, and enjoy it. You can do wonderful things with consenting adults and have a great sex life and never feel guilty about it, never feel shame about it. It's a wonderful experience of liberation. And I feel for all of the people who are deeply, deeply embedded in Christianity, like that poor pastor who tortures himself over it. It's very, very sad. Anyway.
Very sad. No, that's really well said. And I think you and I have future conversations to have. And it doesn't have to be about the presentation, because we've done the presentation. And I know that you might put new ones together at some point or whatever if you decide. But we could go into deeper weeds about all sorts of different areas and discussions, because you and I connect on there's so much you say and we understand each other. And I think there's a lot of people will be helped by this conversation. I'm just being raw and authentic. I'm just being real with you. A lot of people don't talk like this, but I think it's important I'm transparent because I know, to me, first of all, there's a sense psychologically of confession that I do think is useful. And I don't mean it in the rigorous, and then also, just keep repeating the actions you might've done that are bad kind of things. But I'm saying you're not hiding anything. You're just being who you are, and there's a sense you
Yeah.
feel free when you're just being honest, but also there's how many people it helps. So thank you. Oh, I meant to say, can't stop, won't stop. Thank you for becoming a member. And Chris Wood, your patience is literally divine. Thank you so much for waiting. Thank you for that 20. This is more psychological, this is more psychology philosophy. But does Dr. Wathey have any opinions as to what those high in neonatal belief in God should do about it? I'm in that camp. I find the experience of oneness very meaningful. Is it harmful?
I actually don't think so. I think I was talking a few minutes ago about the feelings I have of oneness with nature when I'm out hiking. When I'm having those feelings, I kind of know where it comes from, and I kind of know what it is, and I kind of know that it isn't real, right? I know that the nature that what it feels like is that nature loves me, that this is my home, this is where I belong, I'm accepted here, I'm loved here, okay? But the next rattlesnake I happen to step on isn't going to feel that way.
Right.
It will defend itself and it will bite me, and it's going to be a really miserable hike, right? So I'm aware of the reality of the situation, but I can still indulge those feelings. I can still feel that warm, fuzzy feeling, and this is a great experience, and I just feel really at home here, and this is wonderful. But I still watch where I put my feet while I'm walking.
Yeah, this kind of makes me think of the theodicy issue in a way too, though. Like this kind of connects to theodicy, like how we look at the world I see wonder, I see amazing things, and that prenatal, the neonatal, the neonatal experience sense that I get from the compassion of my mom, nurture, like love, all the good aspects that we get out of mothers for us infants. Uh, we're just grown infants at this point. Is I see that, and I look at the world and try to look at that through that lens. I try to experience it through that lens. Um, and that's why a lot of people, I think, in high, pressure, very stressful times of their life break down. They have existential crisis. They need medical attention. They need antidepressants. They need something that isn't giving them, I think, that sense of relief and calmness that they get to be able to go through life. And we look at nature, and we also then see that ugly aspect that we're trying to explain through this God that we are trying our best to understand the world that we've experienced, but it also is like such a horrific world, and it can be very ugly and very disgusting and harsh, not only with our own just natural diseases that come about, illnesses, cancers, you name it, we can't even help. But then also just the world, the beast that are out there, the other kind of species that are out to get us. You name it, the list can go on and on, the theodicy problem. And I think it relates to this in a sense of his philosophy aspect. You got psychology and philosophy here. And I kind of want to turn this question even deeper with you, Jack, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
And that is, since we can't get rid of it, and we also think, okay, this is kind of our brain is doing something from the infancy, from the wiring of our mothers as a child. Shouldn't we take advantage of it, though, and then utilize it to help us increase our well-being in our lives, knowing that it functions from that, like scientifically, we have that aspect you're describing. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, tomorrow, you end up getting a global prize, and people go, "Oh my gosh, Jack, you cracked the code. We just need to do this little thing, this little thing," and this is the case. Now that we know scientifically that this is the case, shouldn't we take advantage of it and then apply it, but not to imaginary ancient, concepts that have dogma attached to them that can be harmful, but maybe reinvent new ideas and say, hey, we're going to couch our facts with a social model to help humans with meaning and life and how to, I don't know, move forward with this. Does what I'm saying make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you've triggered a couple of thoughts in my mind asking that question. One of them has to do with how we as a society can help young children in their early development. Some kids are raised in really terrible homes where the parents, are abusive, or they're addicts, or they're absent, or neglectful, or whatever. And they if the situation's bad enough, they'll be taken out and given to foster parents. But if they're in some middle ground where the parents are, not so bad that they should lose their children, and yet bad enough that they're really not giving the children everything they need, how and where should society intervene or supplement, at least, maybe supplement is the right word, what the parents are providing? How can they make up for what the parents are not providing? And how old should the child be when that happens?
Yeah.
I think you can learn a lot from the science of attachment, and this is psychology. There's a lot of psychological research on attachment. And you can learn a lot from that about when it's important to intervene or supplement to make up for what the child is missing, to the extent that that can be done. Should it be done in kindergarten? Should it be done in first grade? Should it be done in preschool? And the answer from the research is really the younger the better. If you can do some kind of preschool, if you can't do it in a preschool, if you can somehow send an assistant of some kind to a midwife or whatever. I don't know what word you want to use, but send some kind of an assistant to help a struggling mother or struggling parents learn how to be better at the attachment behaviors that an infant needs, the touching, the physical interaction, the constant voice, the slow, melodic, almost musical voice of motherese, it's called, where a mother speaks with her infant. If those things don't come naturally to some people, maybe people could be hired by the state or the school system or whatever to help out with teaching those skills. That's one thought that comes to mind. Had a feeling there was another one, but that slips my mind at the moment. But
yeah,
maybe
I think
it'll
I
come
was
to me.
Yeah, and I was just pointing out like utilizing it, right? Like since we know it's a fact, let's just grant that it's proven like beyond a shadow of a doubt. I think my intuitions tell me you're on the track, and I think that's why you were led down the path you did as a neuroscientist, but it makes so much sense even if there are more factors you and I are both blind to that might actually play a role in it. But there's enough there to see something happening. And I know something's going on with what you're describing here that makes a lot of sense. So I was just thinking, if we know that, because we also have this social issue online, we're dealing with the internet. Okay. On the internet, you have to almost be all or nothing in a camp. A lot of people prefer, and I imagine this gets into like social psychology or whatever, they prefer like, if it's religious and they've left religion and there's like the whole group of people who are ex-Christian, ex this, that you're allergic. We're all allergic together against anything that touches or has anything to do with. And it's like, there's actually a lot that is useful. There's a lot that you can find within religions that can be helpful or even have utility, and yet still see the harm. And people aren't interested in nuance. They're not very much, or at least the pressures that be socially aren't interested in nuance. And so I'm thinking, if we knew that was fact, how do we use that? How do we use that to say, look, if everyone was born an atheist tomorrow, they got to get through life, and life isn't easy. So how can we use this knowledge to craft something new, maybe, or give them another pathway instead of an age-old religion that said the cult leader is the only way, and you have to think like them, you have to do like them, you have to act like them, and of course, all the interpretations that come from that. Almost like, how do we create new religions? But I don't want to call them religions necessarily, but like without the dogma, with this in mind.
Well, one thing that also triggers a few associations. One thing that comes to mind is religion. One of the great things it does, it's basically a good thing most of the time, is that it brings people together. Like I said, it fosters trust within the in-group. So as long as you're one of the members, as long as you're part of that in-group, the other people in that group will treat you better. They'll trust you. You can make friends there. It's just a social organization where you can meet people and make friends. And there's a real need for that. And in our society, religion is one of the main ways we get that. And we also get it at work during our work lives. I'm retired now. I don't have that kind of work life anymore. I don't go to a university. I don't go to an office. I don't, interact day to day doing things to earn a living anymore. School is another one. Going to classes, or living in a dorm as a college student, you make friends. You have a social group. You're all aimed at a common purpose. It makes you feel close to people. It's a great way to make friends. And some of my friendships from those times are still very active today. I've held some friendships for a long time. But you can find other social groups that serve that need. So that's one direction you can go. For example, when I met my wife at a place called Contra Dancing, it's a once a month thing where we would get together and we had a live band and we'd do these folk dances that date back to, I guess, Ireland, really trace them back at least a couple hundred years. But things like line dancing and square dancing are very similar to that kind of stuff. And it was just a fun thing to do. And it was physical, and the same people would be there every month. You get to know people, you dance with them, you touch, you move to the music, you're kind of in sync with one another. Religions do that stuff too, right? Religions do a lot of that musical stuff and chanting and moving together and all of that. Those rituals do a lot of good psychologically. And I met my wife there. We were going to the same university, but we actually met at contra dancing. So that you can seek out places like that and get that dimension, that aspect of religion, without any of the supernatural belief system or our religion's better than your religion or any of that. So that's one way you can seek that out and achieve that. And another way, and this is something my wife has done just recently, she's a singer. She loves music. She's been going to a small singing group where we live that specializes in Renaissance music, and she loves that kind of music and has been doing that for many years. And over the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, they've had their rehearsals in a church that's near where we live. And some of the people in that church, in the church choir, I guess saw the rehearsals and joined the group, or maybe it was somebody who was in the group to begin with, who was in that church, said, oh, why don't you use our church for rehearsals? I can't remember how it started, but anyway, there's connection there between the church and this singing group that my wife is in. And she made enough friends who were in that church and learned enough about what that church is. It's a very liberal church. It's not very dogmatic. Certainly, it's not a cult in the sense of having a cult leader, and the cult leader tells you everything about how you should live your life. It's a very laid back, easygoing, tolerant, accepting, open sort of church. And there are several people in it who don't believe in God at all. Sort of like the Unitarian Church has that kind of a reputation. A lot of Unitarian churches are like that. This is not Unitarian; it's a different denomination. But anyway, it's a very liberal, easygoing church. So my wife joined this church just for the social interactions and for participating in their church choir, which she also likes doing that kind of music. She doesn't believe any of the God stuff. She doesn't keep it a secret that she's an atheist. She's quite open about it. But it's just a way of getting some of the good stuff that religion does provide without taking it too seriously. So you can go that direction.
I mean, it also is, if we look at like the scale of time on this planet, it's yesterday that religion was there, but the day before that, it was tribal campfire dancing and social hunting together, and like going and getting the food together, hunter-gatherer style, and we still believed in spirits and things, but we didn't have a God. We did not have this social cohesion. We did not have the societal structures we have. And so it's interesting how like religion wants, a lot of the apologists at least have this really, really narrow view of time. They want you to look at yesterday, but they don't want you to look at the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that, and realize we're just in like tomorrow will be a different thing. And I'm hoping that we keep growing and not be at such odds that we can't find together as humanity the good that we see in all of it, and then get rid of what we find that isn't bettering us overall. And I think that's going to be the important step, is finding a way to do that. And it scares me, to be honest with you. I'm wondering if some people can get rid of these dogmas. I know that it can be done. It's just like, will we as humanity get to a place where we can all get there? All right. You want to keep the social structure, the religion, whatever, belief in something, cool. Defang it of anything that's going to cause us to hate each other, that's going to cause us to have these views, because we're in this together. It makes me think of the famous saying by one of the presidents, and I can't remember which one. He says, if we had a extraplanetary threat. We would all pull together and drop our differences in a heartbeat, realizing our extinction is on the line if we don't drop oh, your God's that God, or I'm going to bomb you if you don't, that's my piece of land. All of that stuff is going to have to stop if we had that, so.
Yes.
Anyway, I got another super chat. We got Mo here. Thank you so much for the super chat. Even if self-concocted, it's still necessary. I wonder what that's related to. I don't know.
I'm not entirely sure what that means. I would say the way I'm inclined to interpret that is that self-concocted is, I think what might be meant there is that it's innate. It's that we're born with it, and that we come up with these God beliefs because we have this stuff in our brains. And it's still necessary part, I would say, to me, what that says is it's necessary because we do need to be attached to our mothers when we're helpless infants, right? That's why it evolved in the first place. That was the selective pressure for it to be there in the first place. So if that's the interpretation, I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. Thank you for the super chats there. Back to you, Jack. So, okay, where do we go from here? I would like to ask this. I imagine you have other neuroscientists that you communicate with, that have you made any leeway with some of them, your colleagues, your friends, in terms of what you've proposed?
Well, I've tried to reach out to some of the younger neuroscientists. Neuroscientists my age are pretty much out of the field,
right?
Just like I am. They're not active anymore. They're not doing research anymore, most of them. So even if they were, the friends that I personally knew in graduate school and as a postdoc, they weren't doing anything remotely related to religion when they were doing neuroscience. So they might not be the most helpful people anyway. So I've tried to reach out to younger neuroscientists who are interested in what's going on in the brain during religious experiences. And there's some fascinating research on this subject. That's mostly in the second book, in The Phantom God. There's a guy named Michael Ferguson. He's a young professor. I think he's at Harvard now. Last time I checked, he was at Harvard. He's an ex-Mormon. He's a Mormon apostate. But the Mormon Church makes a big deal about communing with the Holy Spirit and about meditating and praying, and they have a whole bunch of techniques that they use to try to sort of get in touch with, I forget, I think they call it something like feeling the Spirit or knowing the Spirit. They have a phrase for it, which I'm not sure I'm remembering. But it's something. It's a kind of a personal ritual that you do in a kind of a meditative way to get in touch with and feel the presence of the Holy Spirit. So Mormons can become very skilled at this and can elicit these feelings that we've been talking about, like those Carmelite nuns can do that I mentioned in the talk. So he evidently has had that experience himself, and he has recruited people from the Mormon Church to do that while he's doing brain scanning, neural imaging of them in an fMRI machine. And he was the one who, as far as I know, he's the first one to show that during the peak of that feeling of God's presence, in the case of these Mormon subjects, the nucleus accumbens becomes active. That's the epicenter of the reward system. That's the place of, the vulnerable site where the addictive drugs work that we were talking about earlier. That he was the one to first show experimentally that that's part of what's happening during religious experiences. So I thought he'd be very interested in the book, and I sent it to him. And My guess is I communicated with him by email, and he said, he was quite upfront about it. He said, I'm teaching all these courses right now, and I've got all this work to do. I just don't have time for it right now. I'll see if I can get to it during the summer. And I just know what their lives are like. It's the reason that I did not become a professor myself. It's utterly consuming. So my guess is he has not read it, just
Yeah.
because he didn't have time. He's got lots of other things that other people are asking him to read. They've piled up on a shelf somewhere, and my book is in there somewhere. So
Mm.
I'd never heard back from him. And I've reached out to a few other people in that way. The only one, I've had a few people I have had some responses from. A fairly prominent psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, has read one chapter of my book. I actually ran into him at a meeting, a scientific meeting at the Salk Institute, and I was in the process of writing the book at the time, and I chatted with him because I liked a lot of his ideas, and I asked him if he'd look at this chapter. So he read a chapter and commented on it. And another psychologist who's very active on this subject is Lee Kirkpatrick. Now he's about my age by now. He probably is retired also, but at the time he was still active, and he read at least one chapter, maybe more by now. We had a long chat by email, and he was very receptive to some of my ideas, and it was a very, very satisfying interchange. And some of our conversation sort of leaked into chapter 6 of my first book. So there's that. To that extent, I've had some acceptance. Another very helpful person, for a fan, you might say, but also a scientist, or at least a physician, as a therapist, is Andy Thompson at the University of Virginia. He's a psychiatrist. You've probably had him on your show. He's written about religion and the science of religion. He wrote the book, Why We Believe in Gods, which was an attempt to try to survey the entire diversity of ideas and theories, scientific ideas and theories about where religion comes from. He's a big fan of my ideas and my books. I'm in touch with him through email, and he and I have been in conversations together on podcasts sometimes. And another one that was very moving and special to me was Sarah Hrdy, Hrdy is her last name. She's a sociobiologist by training, also a primatologist. She's done a lot of work with primates. And she's done a lot of work on the interactions between mothers and infants, in primates mostly, but in non-human primates mostly, but also she's written a lot about human mothers and human infants. And I've read several of her books. I've relied kind of heavily on her ideas in my own books. And so I reached out to her, and she read enough of it and saw some of my talks and so on, and was very, very kind to write back, and was very supportive and encouraging. So I have some fans out there.
Yeah.
What I'm hoping, and I'm glad you brought this up, by the way, I am hoping that some young people watching this today who are interested in, or maybe already are in, a career in the sciences, maybe psychology or possibly neuroscience, cognitive science, whatever. If you're interested in studying religion as part of your research, I hope you'll take a look at my books, just to look for the places where I say, oh, this is a prediction I can make based on this hypothesis. This is the way such and such an experiment should go if this idea is right. I got a lot of those scattered throughout both books. And I mentioned a few in the talk that I gave today. If you're in that position someday, doesn't have to be now, but maybe someday, look up those ideas and see if you want to do the experiments. I'd love to have somebody else do the experiments. I'm not in a good position to do them myself. I'm too old. but somebody younger could, and I hope somebody will someday. That would be wonderful.
Hopefully someone can, Jack. Really appreciate that. We got a couple super chats here. Farsight asks an interesting one, and thank you for the super chat. I low-key think that my dog believes in God, or superstition at least. She probably thinks that I'm a deity. You can see it when objects like balls don't behave like she thinks they should.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad you wrote that. There is a beautiful passage written by Charles Darwin, basically saying the same thing you just wrote, but with somewhat different examples. But I think it's in The Descent of Man. I think that's the title of the book. I'm pretty sure it was in that book. He has several passages in there about religion and where he thinks religion comes from. And when he's discussing it, he says basically the same thing, that dogs have this devotion to their human that is so loyal and so strong that you cannot get around the view that the dog must be seeing you as a godlike figure. And he cites that as one thing. And he said, for example, that my dog will just sit or lie down on the floor while I'm in the room and doing my work, and the dog doesn't seem to be paying any attention to me at all. And I get up and I go to another room and I do something else, and the dog starts whining because I'm not there. So that's one example. And the other one that he gave was more like along the lines of the superstition thing. He describes a scene where he sees his dog out on the lawn, outdoors, and there's some object, I can't remember now what it was, some lightweight thing, I don't know, a piece of clothing or a cardboard box, or I don't know what it was, some paper thing, lightweight. And the wind comes along and starts moving this inanimate object. And the dog freaks out. It starts, it snarls and it barks and it howls, and it's reacting as if there's an invisible man moving this thing, and he's barking at the invisible man because that's really freaking him out. He's assuming that there's an agent involved, and he's doing the thing he would do if a threatening stranger were coming onto the property. He would bark and he'd snarl and he'd, stalk the thing. And so Darwin was making the point that the dog is basically doing the kind of thing we do when we're inventing religion to try to come to terms with natural disasters, the thunder and the lightning and the storms and all the stuff we see going on around us. We ascribe agency to it, even when there's no agency there. So anyway, you're not the first to make this observation. You're in good company. Darwin said basically the same thing.
Thank you, Farsight. Solaranite, thank you for the super chat and being a member. I really appreciate it. Luke 17, the kingdom of God is within Intos.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, isn't it? That is one way to interpret that verse, that maybe there's something really prescient in there that foresees what science is now showing us, I hope, in a better way.
Yeah, it makes me think of Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance example, where they expect certain things and then they reinterpret it to make it mean something more esoteric, more spiritualization. That is typically how a lot of the scholars I've read talk about the kingdom of God, because there was a real political expectation for messiahs. And then when it doesn't happen and he dies, it becomes a spiritual kingdom. It becomes internalized. You put in a Jesus mouth, my kingdom's in heaven, not of this earth. Things that no real Messiah would have been expected to have said in a Jewish context, using a heuristic comparison to other examples of Jewish messianic expectations in that way. But who knows? I mean, it does tap into this whole the kingdom of God within is like a comforting sounding thing, like back to the neonatal, love and compassion, and the fruits of the spirit are also expected to be part of that kingdom and how we're supposed to behave. Anyway, yeah, thank you. Another one is Wade Rogers. Thank you for the super chat and being a member. Thoughts on the need for infants to separate their sense of self from their parents, then projecting that on a sky daddy. This separation happens around 24 months of age. Just joined the show. Thank you, Wade.
Oh, interesting. I'm not too familiar with that aspect of the psychological research. There probably is something like that going on. There probably is this feeling of unity between the infant and the mother that changes a little bit, or maybe changes a lot, when the infant is no longer completely helpless. When they, like you said, at around age 2 years, kids are acquiring language, they're walking, they're doing things, they're much more active and starting to assert their independence. It's when famously, it's when they first start saying no to their parents a lot. The terrible twos, I've heard it called. So, yeah, something like that does happen. Now, the projecting of that onto the sky daddy, well, I think, that it's hard to say. I feel like the projection of all of this parental stuff, these innate models of the mother and the more elaborate models of both mother and father that form partly through learning during childhood, those probably get projected onto God later in life. But it depends on how deeply immersed you are in religion as a child. If you're deeply immersed, your parents are taking you to churches or religious services all the time during your childhood, then you'll develop it sooner at an earlier age than someone who doesn't have that much immersion. Mm-hmm. So that probably varies from individual to individual.
Yeah, Wade, thank you again for another super chat. And they said dog trainers throw towels, rags in front of dogs to get them to stop bad behaviors because dogs see that as a supernatural act that they can't do.
That's an interesting observation. So a little bit, it harkens back to what we were talking about earlier with Darwin's observation of his dog and the invisible ghost moving the object on the lawn. Yeah, I'm reluctant to read too much into the minds of the dogs, but sometimes it's really hard not to. It sure seems like they're acting that way, that they see some kind of supernatural force at work in front of them.
Absolutely. Wade, I really appreciate that support. So, Jack, we're coming up on almost 2 hours, and I'd like to shamelessly plug you once again. You're fascinating, and I love your humble nature about this. And I think it's also important that you're like that for people who are believers, because some people who are in the atheist world might be more like Dawkins and delusion. And it can be a little rough around the edges, so to speak. And it's people like you who are much more gentle in your approach and understanding, I think, of even if it were delusional. I think we all have some kind of delusion. Okay. So it's much more empathetic, I feel like, your approach is to many people of believing persuasions, and you understand it. Like, it's almost like, how can we fault people who don't even realize that they're doing the thing? Like, it's not their fault that they they think this way. What we try to do is I call it harm reduction, because people are like, well, you want everyone to be an atheist, right? And I'm like, not necessarily. Like, I know that there's some people who feel like they need something. So for me, it'd be cool if everyone could figure out all that stuff and come to a very peaceful, very meaningful life without needing to believe in these things, but that's not my goal. My goal is to really help mitigate some of the harms that come from
Yeah.
belief systems, because I know not everyone will ever get to, we don't all need to think the same exact way anyway, but at the same
Yeah.
time, yeah, your approach is very generous, I would say, and I'm thankful for that kind of approach.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Yeah, of course. And then Knight writes, paraqueductal gray versus the temporal lobe. I'm not sure if I said that right.
Oh,
Paraqued.
that I have a recommendation for you. I said earlier, people should start with my first book, The Illusion of God's Presence, because it's not as technically demanding as my second book. But if you're asking me a question about the periaqueductal gray versus the temporal lobe, you are ready for my second book. That's exactly the kind of stuff I talk about in there. I'm trying to remember I can't remember which chapter it is. Do I have that book here? Hang on just a second. I don't think I have the book. I don't have the book within easy arm's reach. But in my second book, The Phantom God, I do talk about some fascinating research, and I believe Michael Ferguson, the guy I was talking about earlier, I believe he was involved in this research. It was a study that took in a whole bunch of literature. They took data from a whole bunch of other scientific studies. So this is what's called a meta-analysis. They reanalyzed data from a whole bunch of other studies about neurological studies. So these are studies of people who have had some kind of brain damage, and the location of the damage is worked out, and the symptoms that come from it are described in these various scientific papers. So he was looking for, and this group is actually done by a group of people. Ferguson was one of them. They were putting together a whole bunch of data like this and trying to look for papers where something about religiousness was altered as a result of some damage to the brain. And from doing that, they would map these things out in the brain, and they would look at what do these things have in common? What can we say about how these parts of the brain are connected to one another or connected to other parts of the brain downstream? And what they found, is that what they all had in common, what they all sort of led to downstream, was what's called a periaqueductal gray. It's in the midbrain. It's in the brain stem. So it's sort of, if you could imagine your spinal cord coming up into the brain. And what happens when it does, it comes up through the bottom of the skull and continues into what's called a brain stem, which it just looks like your spinal cord is enlarging. And it's in that area, in the brainstem, this enlarged thing, that you'll find the periaqueductal gray. It's involved in lots of interesting behaviors. It's a motor system, sort of, but it's also a sensory system. It's sort of kind of halfway between spinal cord and what we normally think of as brain. Spinal cord has a lot of stuff in it that has local circuits that interact with your arms and legs to control various parts of your body or various organs within your body independently, without having to bother your consciousness about it. When you stand up from having, been sitting in a chair for a while, you don't have to consciously say, oh, I better raise my blood pressure now, I'm going to faint. There's something in your autonomic nervous system that does that for you. And that's way down in the spinal cord and the various low areas like that. Periaqueductal gray is sort of halfway between that and the thinking part of your brain. And attachment behaviors are a big part of what it's involved in. So it's sort of the downstream of things like the orbitofrontal cortex that I was talking about earlier, actually making things happen in the body. Digestion or lactation in the case of a mother. So yes, that appears to be that's an interesting clue. There's nothing in there that's specifically religious. But it's all the things that are sort of specifically religious in the brain send connections to it. So that's a fascinating article, and I go into a lot of pages on that in this one chapter in the second book, and I wish I could remember which chapter it is, but it's near the end of the book. It's pretty. There are three parts to that book. There's a very short summary part, a middle part where I sort of look for all the parts of the brain that have to do with innate attachment behaviors and infantile behaviors. And then the third part, which is a review of other people's research on religion and the brain. It's in there. Temporal lobe, by the way, is also a place that's been implicated in religious behaviors. And I do talk about that a little bit. The temporoparietal junction that I talked about earlier, where you can elicit the illusion of a sense presence, that's right on the edge of the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe does a lot of other things. It's involved in representing familiar people. And since God is often conceived of as a person, a sort of a super person, there may be some representation of God in there. The reason it's been associated with religion is that people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, some of them, a distinct subset of them, become hyper-religious.
Right.
So I do talk about that in the second book.
Have you ever heard about that? You've got me thinking about there's some accounts in Islam where Muhammad was having experiences that they would describe as like epileptic type of seizures, and he was experiencing, describing his experiences in ways where you would be like, what? And he, of course, ends up being hyper religious at the same time. I've heard that explained by some ex-Muslims who started evaluating it, and they looked into the science and thought maybe this explains why he was so religious, is he was having seizures, and he was one of those who may have been like that. Have you heard of that yourself?
I haven't heard of that in the case of Muhammad. I've heard of it in another context. I think the Saul, who became the Apostle Paul, had this vision of Jesus where he was struck by the beam of light and the appearance of Jesus and on the road to Damascus, and had his conversion because of this dramatic religious experience. There are some neurologists who say that could have been temporal lobe epilepsy. He could have been having a seizure. He could have been having, post-ictal hallucinations or whatever. It's fun to think about stuff like that. I don't take it too seriously myself because these are historical figures. The history we have about them is pretty ancient already and not entirely reliable.
Yeah.
We can't do an EEG on them and see if they have epilepsy or not. So, it's fun to think about stuff like that. I just don't want to draw too many serious conclusions from it, though.
Yeah, and I have one more question for you as we've got all the super chats out of the way. Do you know Mark Solm's book, The Hidden Spring? Have you read that?
No, I don't know that one.
The Hidden Spring. Yeah, it's all about trying to explain where consciousness comes from. He doesn't take I don't think he takes the same path Daniel Dennett did, but in his book, he talks about the brain stem playing a significant role, and he goes through situations where he shows the reason it even piqued his interest and he went down this career path is his brother. I don't know if it's his twin brother or if it's just his brother, fell off the 2-story building and he hit his head on the concrete, and it permanently, he said his brother was not the same person, literally not the same person. We're not talking about like he was hurt and he wasn't quite there. He became a completely different human being. He did not know who his brother was. And he was a young kid when he had this experience, and he realized that the day that happened, he became a different human being. So he spends this, really goes deep in the weeds. You'll understand a lot more of the terminology than I do, because it's not a field that I'm aware of, the brain and the terminology. But he is explaining how they did a lot of tests on people who literally are born without any cortex and yet still function.
Wow.
And he was explaining that, yes, they are obviously not normal in the average sense of what humans who have a full cortex have, but he was describing where does consciousness come from, because they could still smile, there's still things that they have. And he thinks it comes down, he calls this book The Hidden Spring, from the brain stem, somewhere deep down in that region. He thinks is where the spark of it ultimately is in terms of consciousness. But I'm probably strawmanning it. I mean, it's much more complex and complicated. He's the doctor who was assessing me on the whole opiate addiction and was describing it. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. I'll have to find that. I'll have to read that. Sounds very interesting.
Absolutely. I'd love to get your thoughts on it too, because I know you're into this. Last one, ladies and gentlemen. If your life needs meaning, just remember my name. Make the world a better place for the next generation. MTWABPFTNG. Thank you for the super chat. Really appreciate it. I will remember your name. As they said, Achilles said to the young boy who went to go get him in the Iliad. And the boy comes to get him. He says, "Hey, Agamemnon's calling you." And he finally's heading that way. And I can't remember what he said to him, but he said, "That's why no one will remember your name." That's what he said, something like that. Anyway, last words from you, Jack.
None really, other than thank you very much. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to do this. Thanks again for the invitation. It's been wonderful.
Absolutely. Go get his books, ladies and gentlemen. Are they on Audible, or are they only in
they're only in print form, I'm afraid. But
okay. Gotcha.
Maybe someday.
Yeah, maybe someday. Thank you so much, Jack. Let's do this again.
Definitely. Love to.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are Myth Vision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.